So I am here with Chris Norris, CEO of Metro Housing Boston. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
You're welcome, Faith. Nice to see you.
So Metro Housing Boston, it's a new name for an organization that's been around for a very long time. Can you share more about what Metro Housing does, how it came to be, and the changes that have been made since its 2017 evolution?
Sure, of course. We were founded almost 40 years ago by a gentleman named Bill Edgerly, who was the CEO of State Street Corporation at the time. And Bill had a vision of working to preserve subsidized housing that was at risk of being lost and foreclosed on. And there was a relatively new program at the time called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program. And so he got together a variety of different folks from the business world who invested and purchased low-income housing tax credits. And the money that they used to purchase that was treated as equity that was used by local community development corporations to preserve about 1,200 units of affordable housing. And the organization that Bill founded was called the Boston Housing Partnership, BHP, which was the organization that worked with the community development corporations to provide the technical assistance to allow for that work to take place.
And what has been your role there during this time?
Sure. I'm the executive director. I started in 2007. Next month will be my 15th anniversary at Metro. And over time, we really have come into expanding our services, such as fair housing or additional housing supports. We're no longer in the real estate business. We actually don't own, operate, or develop housing any longer. In fact, all of that housing that was preserved is now owned at the local level by those very same CDCs. And instead, we focus our work on working with 10,000 families who have rental assistance vouchers. And then we work with another 15,000 or so families annually to provide support services. We know that the voucher is often just the very first step, but once someone is in a home, they may have a challenge with a landlord. They may lose a job. They may have questions about utilities, any number of things that come up for all of us daily in terms of our housing. And so we have branched out over time to expand our support services to keep people stably housed once they are housed. In fact, over the last 2 years, we saw with the pandemic some dramatic growth. We had 150 employees when the pandemic started in March of 2020, and today we have 265.
That is a very big growth of the company. All right, so that's incredible. So over 25,000 families being served by the organization. And what types of programs do you offer?
Sure. We work in 32 cities and towns, including Boston. We provide the rental assistance that I was talking about, administering vouchers, both state vouchers and federal vouchers. We provide cash assistance. That's where much of the growth has happened over the last 2 years, using some of those federal funds that were provided to keep people stably housed when they were impacted by the pandemic. And then we also have general supports, like I was talking about, relative to any number of situations that folks might run into. And then we work with families who are currently homeless but looking for housing. So we'll work with them to provide housing search. We will work with them to make sure their materials are all in order so that they're able, if or when they are able to secure housing, that they have everything they need to move forward and become stably housed.
Gentrification has been really making its presence known in Boston. We have developers that are coming in, they're steadily buying buildings and property. A lot of longstanding families are being displaced. With rentals increasing throughout the city in some places, 220% in East Boston, for instance. What are some ways that renters can protect themselves?
That's a great question, and it's a really challenging environment across the board. There are two things. I think one is organizing with neighbors and talking to your neighbors and realizing that you're not alone. At times, I think people are faced with these situations, may think it's just them and they don't have anywhere to turn. And there's always more strength in numbers and working together than doing it alone. And the other opportunity is to work with your local neighborhood organizations. You mentioned East Boston, and the Neighborhood of Affordable Housing in East Boston is a great organization that works within the community and with residents of East Boston. But there are community development corporations across the city in many of the neighborhoods that are being impacted by gentrification. And working at the neighborhood level can also prove to be very effective.
All right, so talking with your neighbors and researching the available resources is key. And I saw that you actually had an op-ed that was published on July 8th in Commonwealth Magazine. Congrats.
Thank you.
Um, in it, you share some very startling statistics. You mentioned that 1 in 4 renters, they pay over half of their income to rent. So what are some of the factors that are contributing to the skyrocketing costs in rent in Massachusetts right now?
Sure, I would think there's two, and one of is obviously common economics, which is high demand and too little supply, particularly for the families that we work with who are often among those with the lowest incomes in the state. Our families are often working, part-time jobs or low-wage jobs, but on average, a household of three that we work with has an annual income of $15,000. And we're not building housing that families can afford for $15,000 annually when that's their total income. And so obviously demand and too little supply is driving up costs for everyone. The other thing is, we work with 4,300 property owners, and we couldn't do our work without them. And costs for owners are going up, just like everything else. So just maintaining the property itself is costing more for those owners, who then have to raise the rents to account for what they are experiencing in terms of the outflow of cash managing the building. So I would say it's those two. It's high demand, too little supply, and inflation and the costs generally that are being experienced by owners.
So everyone essentially is being impacted by this. And in your article as well, you talk about how the state should codify the Massachusetts rental voucher program for stabilizing housing costs. Can you talk more about what MRVP is and why it's important that Massachusetts makes this a law before the end of this legislative session?
Sure. I was really happy to be joined by Rachel Heller, who's the CEO of CHAPA, Citizens Housing and Planning Association, as well as a much larger group that is calling for mass rental voucher program to be codified. MRVP is the state voucher program. It's similar to Section 8. The voucher pays a portion of the rent, and the tenants pay 30-40% of their income toward rent. And it allows for the lowest income households in particular to be able to afford housing given this market. They pay a percentage, the voucher covers the balance. And one of the reasons to codify it is that although Massachusetts was one of the first and still one of very few states to have a state voucher program, it's not written in law. So there is no predictability or consistency. The program can change every year. It's not guaranteed. And the requirements for it can change every year. And there are often discussions about the line item and the language in the budget. And it would just be really effective and helpful to have some predictability and to know that the program was enshrined in state law, like so many of our other important programs that we have.
Is there any reason why it hasn't been done up until this point?
I think it just hasn't been a top priority, the codification side of it, but the pandemic raised new emphasis on housing. We saw whether it was housing for elders or housing for families or housing for individuals, we saw what the social determinants of health were around having stable housing. And we felt that this gave us an opportunity to step forward to call again to have the program codified.
So what will it take to codify MRVP into law? And is there anything that Boston residents can do to help?
Sure, of course. The agreement from the legislature is key. The legislation is drafted. The legislation was reported favorably by the Housing Committee. It just needs to rise toward the top of the priority list for legislators before the end of the formal sessions at the end of July. And the primary piece, I know it can seem trite at times, but the primary way people can help is to contact their elected officials, contact your state representative, contact your state senator, contact your city councilor and ask them to contact the elected officials and to explain how important this program is for residents of Boston.
All right, so we still have a couple of weeks until the end of this month, so anything is possible. So here's to it becoming law, being codified. But for our individuals who want to learn more about Metro Housing Boston, how can they do so?
Yes, that's easy. One is to visit our website, which is metrohousingboston.org. It's in a very simple format, question and answer if you need assistance or if you want more information for owners, for residents. It's all available there. And for folks who need assistance directly, they're welcome to call us or email us. The number for our housing hub is 617-425-6700, or people can reach us online by emailing us at resourceline, one word, at metrohousingboston.org.
All right, so plenty of great information there. We got Chris Norris, Executive Director of Metro Housing Boston. Once again, thank you so much for being here today.
You're very welcome, Faith. Thank you for having me.